So I'm going to be talking tonight about social media and bad stuff on social media and disinformation and all of that. I have done a version of this a couple times with Red Wine and Blue. So if anybody has been on these calls with me before, welcome back. So we're here to talk about disinformation and crazy stuff on the internet. So I'm Kelsey. I work at a firm called Upswing. In my job, I do all kinds of things that revolve around social listening, which is just the term for like talking about what is happening on social media, what conversations are happening, what trends, what topics. And so I have sort of developed a little bit of expertise around what is happening in hyperpartisan spaces on the internet, and particularly the far right internet, and disinformation, on social media, and have been working with progressive groups for a few years to identify threats that are coming their way and find strategies to push back on these things in the work they are doing. So we are going to spend our time tonight talking about a lot of that. I'm going to do just a little bit of reflecting on the election, and I'm going to give you all some half-baked thoughts, because even though we are a few months out, it feels like we're all still figuring out what happened in the fall. And then we're going to jump into it. We're going to talk about what disinformation looks like. We're going to talk about what it looks like on social media specifically, and sort of how these things get perpetuated online. We're going to talk about what you all can do when you come across something you think might be false or misleading. And then we are going to talk about how you might respond and sort of what your menu of response options look like. And then we should have time at the end for questions and any wrap up. So I'm just going to start with some quick reflections on the election. And this is still, again, this is something I think a lot of us are still thinking about, myself included, but particularly when it comes to the role that disinformation played in the election, I have found myself struggling to articulate this in like a really good and concise way. So bear with me while I work through this, but I think I am seeing a lot of folks who are a little bit too willing to blame the election results on disinformation and say voters were just deceived, and so the result was because of disinformation, and that's why it went this way. And I think that is kind of true, and it's kind of not true, and we just need to be careful about what sort of conclusions we take after we say something like that. So I just want to name some things that are true and some things that are not true from this election. So some things that are definitely true: we now exist in a world with a very powerful far-right media ecosystem. It is big, it outweighs the mainstream and progressive ecosystem, and it has been aggressively feeding Americans and American voters a bunch of just outright lies on a variety of issues. So there is no discounting that. This problem of disinformation exists, and it is a big, big problem. It is also true that a lot of those lies were, they were political in nature. There was an intended political outcome. These were about blaming marginalized groups of people for the country's economic pain, and that was meant to achieve a political outcome. And so in some ways, it looks like some of that was successful. It is also true that this ecosystem is not just a source of news and political information, and we'll talk more about this, but this is an ecosystem that gives people an identity, it taps into culture, it gives people sort of a worldview. And so the problem we're talking about is a lot bigger than where does somebody get their news. So those things are true, and at the same time, it is not true that we can attribute this whole election outcome to fakery, right? This was not necessarily foreign interference. This was not AI. This was not like Russian bots that sort of reprogrammed us all. Like this was, there were a lot of things that went into voters making the decisions they made. It's also not true that any one lie is the reason for the election outcome. There was like a whole bunch of stuff in the stew. The thing I think is most important is that we cannot come to the conclusion that because disinformation is a problem, that we can no longer trust voters to make choices for themselves. That's what I'm most worried about, that people are going to think, well, voters have been deceived, and so therefore they should not be empowered to make their own decisions and have political agency. And that is obviously not what we want. Similarly, it is not true that we can no longer trust society, institutions, experts. I think there's a lot happening in government now that we cannot trust, but like big picture, the goal of disinformation is to spread distrust. And so we have to continue to place some faith in our institutions in the way they were set up in order to move forward. So these are my like very half-formed thoughts that I'm still working through, but I want to make sure that I am sort of threading this needle between disinformation is a problem and also it is not true that voters are dumb or don't deserve to make their own decisions. And that's where I want to land on our takeaways. We are now a few months past the election, and disinformation is still a problem. It is circulating very, very freely. I used to get hired by people to like tell them what was happening in weird corners of the internet, right? It was like there was this path from these bot accounts and these message boards, and things would kind of slowly trickle through until they got louder and louder. And then all of a sudden we were hearing a lot about it. And it was like, why does everybody suddenly believe this crazy thing? That still happens to some extent, but more and more, if you want to understand what the sort of big lies are at the moment, you just read the news. Like this stuff is top down and it is dominating our political discourse at this point. So I have a bunch of headline examples here of some of the various lies that many of us have been encountering over the past few weeks, but we could put together a list that is much, much longer. I also want to point out this analysis that just came out about a week ago from my friends at Media Matters. They do really good work to understand the overall media ecosystem and the right-wing media ecosystem specifically. So they just did this really interesting report looking at online shows and podcasts. So like YouTube video shows and podcasts, and trying to get a sense of what the balance of ideology looks like. And they found that, probably unsurprising to many of us here, the right wing is really dominating this online media ecosystem when it comes to shows like audio and video. They found that this far right online media ecosystem, it's very big, it's very loud, it's very powerful. And so I want to be clear, this is not really about disinformation. It's like a bigger problem. A lot of what is circulating in this ecosystem is false or misleading, but not all of it is. A lot of this is content that focuses on stories or values or a worldview, but it's not like false. This analysis also found that these far-right voices are varied, and so this permeates pretty much every online platform. So they found that 9 out of the 10 top online shows are right-leaning. They found that this infrastructure has been strong enough to pull the overall conversation to the right. It's sort of shaping culture by consequence. I think it's just generally a helpful illustration of this idea we sometimes hear spoken about, that politics are downstream from culture. And I think this is a good sort of illustration of that. And what they say is that what we need to counter that imbalance is not like one big radio show or influencer or TV show, that we need just more of these blue bubbles across many different audience segments. And so this is not about creating one powerful voice, but it is about building up more of an infrastructure and a network. So I would, I'll put a link to this in the chat, but I would definitely bookmark this for yourselves as helpful reading over the next couple days. So that's, yes, so that is just to get us sort of setting the stage and thinking about this. All of these things are very much still a problem in 2025. And also the problem looks a little bit different now than it did 5, 6, 10 years ago. And so we have to keep kind of updating our thinking based on what is happening. So with that said, let's dive in a little bit more. Let's talk about how this whole disinformation ecosystem online works. And I want to start by just defining some of the terms that we're talking about. I've already said the word disinformation a bunch of times, so let me define it. A lot of people already know the difference between mis and disinformation, but some people use them interchangeably, and they are technically different things. Misinformation is when someone shares something false, but they are not intending to mislead anybody or deceive anybody. You know, most likely they just assumed it was true. They didn't fact check it. They just shared a repeating something that they are heard, assuming that it is true or passing it on without trying to do harm. So all of us have been misinformers at some point in our lives. That's sort of part of the human experience. Disinformation is different. Disinformation is when someone shares something that they know is false because they are trying to lie or deceive people. So it has that intent to do harm behind it. I'm going to assume nobody on this call is a disinformer, but that's sort of a different category of bad actor. That's when you're really trying to do harm. There is also this term malinformation. This is less well known. This is sort of a narrower category. This refers to situations where real data, real information is shared. So the falseness is not the problem, but it's the way it is shared. It is the context around how it is shared. So malinformation is often used to refer to cases where somebody's private data is leaked to intimidate them or embarrass them. So like a doxing situation or like email hack and release strategies. Sometimes it is used to refer to cases where a real image will be taken out of context to imply something other than reality. So recirculating videos of some military conflict from 10 years ago and saying that this is taking place today in, XYZ totally different scenario. So those are kind of the three terms. Some people will also refer to this bucket of stuff as MDM for misdis and malinformation. I like to also lump propaganda into this, which is of course this much broader term that refers to just the act of giving out information in a one-sided way. So you're trying to instill sort of a biased view, but you might use information that's sometimes true and sometimes false, but it's kind of cherry-picked and it's biased. So disinformation researchers love to argue about where the line is between propaganda and disinformation and sort of what counts within our purview and what doesn't. For what it is worth, I think it's kind of unimportant. I think all of these things reinforce each other and they are all feeding into the same overarching misleading narratives. All that when it comes to something like false claims that there is voter fraud in the election, you're going to see misinformation and disinformation and malinformation and propaganda all in the mix, and all of those are achieving, this intended goal to undermine trust in our democracy. So the reality is that the lines across these are very blurry. So I care a lot less about like enforcing accurate terminology. I just want to introduce these concepts and make sure that people know that all of these things exist. All of them contribute to this offline problem that we're all facing. So one of the things that is obviously inherent in, particularly when we talk about mis and disinformation, there's that falseness that's at the core. But falseness is not the only way to do harm. And we talk about that a little bit when we talk about malinformation and propaganda. Oh, there we go. And so what is actually true is that actually a lot of like bad actors online who are trying to do harm. Sorry,
I'm sorry, one moment. Deborah, I'm going to have to remove you if you unmute yourself one more time. I'm muting you for the last time. Lisa, can you help me?
There we go. So a lot of times when we're talking about the problem of disinformation, we're talking about information that is a lie, that is inherently provably false. But the reality is a lot more nuanced than that. And in fact, a lot of these bad actors online are not just outright lying, they are integrating some amount of truth into what they are saying online. So I really like this chart. This comes from an organization called First Draft. That is no longer publishing, but has done really good work in the past. And it sort of gives this spectrum of falseness for content that you might come across online. And so you can start at one end of the spectrum with outright fabricated content, stuff that is 100% made up, attempt to deceive, attempts to do harm. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have things that are more like satire or parody. Think of The Onion, for example. And those things are false, but they're not really meant to be taken seriously, right? They're not meant to deceive people. They're meant to be kind of funny. And then you have a bunch of stuff in the middle that can be sort of misleading or contextualized inappropriately or manipulated in some ways. And so it's just important to know that like false, even the word false can be a little bit tricky. And a lot of times people think that the more false, the more outrageous something is, the more harmful it is. And actually that's not true. Typically, when you see something that is 100% fabricated and made up, it is less persuasive to people. And so we actually worry a lot more about the things that are decontextualized, misleading, imposter content. We worry about things that might appear to be closer to the truth. And it's that grain of truth in there that's going to make it really tricky to figure out what is real and what is not online. Let's also talk about some of the tactics that bad actors use to help them gain some prominence online, because part of this is about what they are saying, and part of it is how they are getting attention for their messages. So there are dozens, many, like very specific tactics that disinformers will use to make themselves louder and more prominent on social media. I'm going to just talk through 5 basic categories, and I see here I have 4 twice, but that is not how numbers work. That should be 1 through 5. So first we are talking about artificial manipulation. So this is all the fakery that a lot of us think of when we think of disinformation. This is like using bots, using fake accounts, creating fake personas, AI deep fakes. This is all the stuff that is just meant to fake you out when it comes to content online. And there is a lot of that, and especially when it comes to these new generative AI tools that can create audio and images and text, we're going to see a lot more of that. And that is the stuff that is sort of outright false, outright artificial, and is really meant to deceive people. So there are a bunch of tactics that go into that. The second thing we see a lot of these bad actors like gaming algorithms. So they basically figure out how these social media platforms work and what kinds of content they are more likely to boost and to share very widely. And they focus really hard on creating just that type of content. So obviously anything that is really sensationalized, that is going to provoke arguments or fear or negative emotions, that stuff tends to get a lot of engagement online, a lot of comments and shares. And so that will tap into that algorithm and spread farther. One thing we also see is anytime a social media company sort of rolls out a new feature or a new format, they're going to give anybody who uses that a little bit of an algorithmic boost, so to speak. So like when Facebook first rolled out Facebook groups for the first time, they started to more heavily promote content coming from Facebook groups. And so when you would log on, you would see stuff from Facebook groups at the top of your feed, because Facebook was trying to get us to adopt that feature and adopt that format and get comfortable with it. So they give it a little boost. So bad actors are good at figuring out little tricks like that to get their content to perform a little bit better online. The third type of tactic we see is around in-network engagement. And this is basically where bad actors create a sense of community online. They create these kind of closed, tight-knit spaces where people will come together around a shared interest or a location. We all live in the same place. And oftentimes these are private, like a private Facebook group or a private WhatsApp channel. And it builds a sense of community and a sense of trust because these are people you have something in common with. And that is where a lot of disinformation will sometimes start to circulate before it sort of moves into the broader mainstream. And that's because when we are in these spaces, we are more inclined to trust the information that comes through them because it feels like, oh, these are our people, I have things in common with them, I can trust them. So that's an easy thing for bad actors to sort of weaponize and manipulate. The fourth tactic or bucket of tactics we talk about is just like effective communication strategies, just good old comms 101, repetition, catchy slogans, making things really clear and concise and memorable, thinking about having like clear heroes and villains in the stories that they are telling. This is just good communications, and bad actors are really good at it. And then my fifth point here gets to that Media Matters chart earlier, which is a lot of the sort of very partisan accounts online who are, manipulating conversations online. Some of them are talking very expressly about politics, but a lot of them are not. They're talking about lifestyle issues. They are talking about celebrity gossip and Hollywood. They're talking about workout routines and fitness. They're talking about recipes, how to raise your kids, activities for toddlers on a rainy day. And so it's these kind of lifestyle issues that are going to pique somebody's interest first and help them build an audience. And then they can kind of more slowly seed in the more political messaging in a subtle way. But because their entry point is not always politics, you're going to appeal to a broader group of people. All right, moving beyond tactics, I want to just make one last point before we go into our next section. And I want to I try to do this every time I talk about this, but I think it's really important to point out that while disinformation does hurt us all, it does not hurt us all equally. And so we need to be really cognizant of the fact that there are communities marginalized, vulnerable communities, communities of color, the LGBTQ community, for example, who are impacted in two different ways. They face this sort of like double whammy of disinformation. So the first sort of bucket of harms is the same bucket of harms that all of us face, where we are all in our own way the intended recipients of these partisan narratives and disinformation. All of us are in different ways the target audience for harmful content. We are seeing things that are meant to change our views, change our perceptions, get us to think a certain way. And so a lot of times these are like sort of the big headlines that might show up on like a Fox News or something, but they might also be tailored for a specific community. So you might see something that is really focused on moms or suburban moms or focused on schools or education. It will be tailored toward a specific community, but it's really kind of leveling up to these same disinformation narratives that everybody is getting targeted with. So that's like one bucket of harms that we think about, the disinformation to communities. And when it comes to vulnerable communities, communities of color, for example, they get their own sort of targeted messages as well. So this is where we see a lot of content that is meant to get communities of color to distrust each other. So we will see, for example, in Asian communities, they might receive a lot of content to make them think of a lot of like harmful stereotypes of other communities of color. So they might be getting a lot of content about like crimes being done to them by a Black perpetrator or something that are meant to reinforce racial stereotypes and create wedges of distrust. A lot of times within communities of color, we will see that bad actors will be appealing to sort of real concerns or cultural values. They might focus on religion or historical harms. A lot of anti-vax content will target communities of color and sort of bring up past historical harms from the US government to try to make them distrust modern vaccines. We see these socialism attacks prominent in Latino communities, for example, and these misleading economic arguments to get them to distrust other groups. And then the other thing we see within a lot of these communities is voter depression. This idea that like, oh, you shouldn't bother turning out, they're all the same, nobody cares about you, don't even bother casting a ballot. So these are all disinformation narratives that are targeted to some of these specific communities. There's also the other side of this, which is these groups also face harm more indirectly from disinformation that is about them. So there is a whole bunch of stuff online, everybody here has seen this, that is about marginalized communities that is not meant for them as the audience. The audience is frankly white, straight, conservative, often male audiences, and this is the stuff that is meant to stoke racist or biased sentiment for political gain. So these are the narratives that are leading to increased hate speech and violence. They fuel anti-immigrant policies and anti-trans policies and voter suppression. This is the stuff that's making the offline environment, the real world, more dangerous for these targeted groups. So I'm not going to spend too much time today focused on specific narratives in either of these buckets, but I do just want to note that for communities of color, LGBTQ community, a lot of other groups out there, they are going to face harm sort of from both angles, and we need to be aware of that. All right, I am going to jump in a little bit more and talk about what this looks like on social media specifically. And I'm going to start by just looking at where people spend their time online and what social media usage actually looks like. And I will say this data is now a teeny bit old. It gets updated every 2 years, but I just have not found a data set that's newer, that's as good as this one. This comes from Pew, which is really trusted. So I am going to continue to use it, but with the caveat that it's about a year old. So these numbers are probably a teeny bit different now. But I want to start by just talking about where Americans are actually spending their time online. So this shows what percentage of US adults say they ever use any of these social media platforms. So not which one do you use the most, how often do you use them, just which of these do you spend any amount of time on. And so this data shows us that Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram are the platforms where the most Americans spend some amount of time. When you dig into this data, you can see that this also tracks across demographics. So it includes both race and political ideology. Gender is not that different. The big demographic difference that does stick out is age. So unsurprisingly, young adults are just, adults under age 30 are much more likely to use all of these social media platforms than their older counterparts. But those age gaps are especially big for Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. That's not surprising to anybody who knows somebody in their teens or 20s. Demographics aside, I also want to pull out some of the changes from 2021 to 2023. So those are those yellow boxes. You can see I have highlighted the jumps in usage for TikTok, Instagram, and WhatsApp. TikTok really is becoming more prominent. I suspect if we had updated numbers, that TikTok number would be even a couple percentage points higher than it is on this chart. But sometimes people look at this and they say, oh, 33% of Americans on TikTok, that feels low. And again, I think it's probably a little bit higher now. But also, like, let's look at that compared to Twitter. TikTok is now being used more than Twitter ever was. Only 22% of Americans are on Twitter. I think the highest that number ever was like 24 or 25%. So you're looking at a quarter of Americans who have ever really used Twitter, and fully a third of Americans and growing are using TikTok. So Twitter does still, even in the Elon Musk era, it kind of punches above its weight just because it's where so many journalists and political leaders spend their time, but it's really not where the general public is. And it's really important for us to remember that. So when we are trying to think about what kinds of content matters online, what is reaching people, what's having an impact, I think it's more important to focus on what is circulating on, Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, and we can kind of deprioritize all the craziness that is happening on Twitter. Okay, so how do these platforms work? Let's talk about how they make their money. And I'm guessing that most of you know this by now, but it's worth reiterating. Social media companies do not make money directly off of their product. Like, we do not pay a fee to use Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or Blue Sky. We are the product being sold. So these companies make money because they understand how we use their product. So they are gathering data about the things we interact with, the things we pay attention to, and they are using that data to get us to spend more time on their platforms, and then they sell that data to groups who are advertising to us based on this personal information. So importantly, users generally we don't really know, nobody's telling it, like, we don't have any transparency into the kinds of data being collected on us. We don't know what platforms know about us or what they're doing with that knowledge. It's kind of secretive. And all of this is because, people talk about us as operating in this attention economy where, like, the most valuable resource for, particularly advertisers, but like most businesses, is attention. Everybody is so bombarded with information and with data and with content that the hardest thing to do is to get somebody to actually pay attention to a thing that you put online, because the internet is just so big and vast. So when your most constrained resource is attention, that becomes really valuable. And that is the thing that social media companies are trying to monetize and sell. So that's why it costs money to, like, promote a post so that more people see it, or to try to, get other sort of flashy things going, so that people might pay attention to your message. But the really good, social media accounts online are people who just know how to get attention, and they can then go on to monetize that skill. And that's why we have, like, influencers who make money, which is just like a crazy job. So the more time we spend online, the more platforms learn about us, the more they collect data on us, and the more they can advertise to us. So what does this practice look like when we get into sort of the nitty-gritty? It is basically fueled by algorithms. So I'm guessing a lot of you here are familiar with this term, algorithm, but this is basically the, like, very complicated mathematical formula that every social media network has that is telling that program how to prioritize information for each of its users. So every platform has its own special algorithm. They're all a little bit different from each other, and they're all a little bit private and proprietary. Social media companies also change their algorithms every so often. They might decide, Facebook decided at one point, we want to prioritize more content between average users, and that's when it rolled out Facebook groups. And then it decided, oh, that just led to a bunch of fighting, and so now we're only going to prioritize content with a lot of engagements, and that kind of led to the creation of these, like, influencers. So they will tweak what gets prioritized in people's feeds. So we know that the specifics are sort of private and proprietary, but we know the basics about how these work. All of these algorithms are trying to prioritize content that are going to get engagements. Engagements meaning views, clicks, shares, basically metrics that measure attention. And so those are, you know, the way that we click, the way we interact, the way we view, like that is kind of the business model behind all of that. And that is the thing that they are trying to maximize when we are online. Some people warn us that this is changing. I'm seeing some people talk about a shift from an attention economy to an intention economy, particularly when it comes to the role that AI is going to play. So the idea here is in an attention economy, you know, social media content is trying to predict what you want to see, but in an intention economy, it is trying to shape what you see. It is trying to like lead you in a specific direction and guide your browsing habits or your purchase, you know, the purchases that you make. Some people are worried that we could sort of start seeing AI programs that are meant to sort of shape our political views based on the way they kind of nudge and recommend things to us. So that is just like an extra thing to keep us all up at night that could be coming for us in the next few years, but that seems to be where some of this AI recommendation technology is heading. And the other thing I want to say is, I think I've made this clear by now, but tech companies are not our friends in this, right? Like tech companies are not going to save us. They are not dedicating a bunch of energy into solving these problems. And in fact, they are doing less and less every year to try to moderate content and to show that they care about user safety. So I've kind of walked through a lot of this for some of the big social media companies. So we have Meta at the top, which is Facebook and Instagram and Threads, but they, you know, have rolled back. They used to really prioritize health disinformation and voting disinformation. They no longer do that. They are dropping their fact-checking program entirely. They're replacing it with this community notes program where average users are supposed to basically apply notes and fact-check things themselves, which is very flawed. They reinstated a bunch of the people they had removed after January 6th. They added Dana White to their board, who is, I forget her, it's a UFC person who is like now very close to the Trump administration, but is also like a sort of has promoted disinformation in various ways. We've also got X. I feel like this one is the one everybody is the most familiar with. After Elon Musk bought Twitter, he dropped most of their content moderation policies. He fired almost their entire trust and safety team. They have limited punishments for anybody who does violate the rules that do exist. So it's sort of a free-for-all on X/Twitter. Obviously, the platform is also actively boosting Elon Musk's own posts, which are often disinformation filled. And of course, we now have Elon Musk in this position in the administration, actively shaping the White House's political agenda, and that is getting sort of supported and boosted through X. TikTok is the next one. They are, frankly, in some ways, kind of the least bad if you can set aside the Chinese data security concerns. But in terms of content moderation, they're laying off their content moderators. They're focused on AI-based moderation that's not as sophisticated. And they have this really powerful algorithm that like hyper targets to individual people. And it can really send people into these harmful rabbit holes of sort of these radical ideologies. Last one is YouTube. Same thing, laying off content moderators, moving to AI-based moderation, scaling back trust and safety teams, moving toward community notes, reinstating January 6th people. So all of these companies are doing less and less to try to solve for the problem of false and harmful content on their platforms, which is making all of this harder. All right, let's start to talk a little bit more about what we can all do about this. And I'm going to start with what you can do at sort of an individual level. How do you spot this stuff when you come across it? So the first rule is so much easier said than done, but it is to check your own emotions when you are browsing online. Anytime you come upon something that is making you feel mad or afraid or hopeless or any sort of negative emotion, that is a sign to yourself that you need to pause and think about what this content is, what it's doing, who it's from, and whether or not you can trust it. The whole goal of disinformation is to stoke these negative emotions because they are so powerful and because they make us want to engage with that content online. And so anytime you have one of those feelings, the first best thing you can do is pause and think about what you are seeing and sort of put on your critical thinking hat. And again, that's easier said than done, but is really important. Next thing you need to do is evaluate what you are seeing. And so this is a really helpful graphic that came from the museum, actually. And it sort of gives you like various things you can evaluate when you are looking at something. So you want to look at the evidence, meaning the facts. You want to check the source, meaning where is this from? You want to check the context, meaning, is this why is this being shared in this moment? Are they talking about this because of other things happening out in the world? You want to think about the audience, which is who is this meant for? Are there, any signs that this is trying to target a group of people? You want to think about the purpose. Why would somebody put this online? And you want to think about the execution, which is how is it presented? What kinds, what is the tone? What is the style? What kind of image or graphic does it offer? And all of those things are going to help you sort of assess any bias or sort of factual inaccuracies. And all of these are things that I think everybody here is very, very capable of doing. And there's really good research to show that when you get people to slow down and ask them, do you think this thing is real or not? People are actually really good at telling what's real from what is fake. The hard part is just remembering to do that with ourselves and keeping that critical thinking hat on when we are browsing. I will also offer a few resources to help with this process. So I have here some fact-checking resources and some source-checking resources. In terms of fact-checking, I really like PolitiFact. I like factcheck.org. AP and Reuters both have very good fact-check. People always ask me about Snopes. I like Snopes as well. I just think that's the one everybody kind of already knows about, but Snopes is really great. But it's just good to have like a favorite fact-checking website so that you can look up this stuff when you need to. Source checking, I think, is actually a little bit harder. And so I think these are really good resources to have at your disposal. I am a big fan of this first one, Media Bias Fact Check. Their website looks a little bit like it was created in like 1997, so don't judge, but they have a very extensive database of websites that look and feel like news outlets, and they will rank those outlets on bias and sort of accuracy of reporting. And I use it all the time when I come across things in my work. NewsGuard is one that a lot of people use, All Sides and Ground News. All of these are really good resources for figuring out, can I trust this source of information? And then I also want to talk a little bit more about what we can do on a bigger level. So first thing, you can figure out whether something is real or false, whether or not you trust it. But then there's the question of like, how do I push back on this? What do I do here? So I have a few tips. And the first rule of countering disinformation is to do no harm and to not make it worse. And the way that you are going to make it worse is by amplifying it or spreading it inadvertently. So this feels very simple and it's actually really tricky. One of the trickiest parts of interacting on social media is that the way you interact with content, the way you engage with content is going to determine how far something spreads and specifically whether our own networks see something. So we talked about that attention economy business model, the fact that social media platforms are tracking and all of our data and that's, the thing that they are monetizing. So that means that the way you spend your time online is, currency. It is like literally currency. It is literally valuable. Your attention is the business model, right? So that means that your views, your clicks, your comments are valuable in a very literal sense of the word. They are, they have monetary value assigned to them. And so you want to spend that currency wisely and be really strategic about how you engage online. Platforms, social media platforms are not differentiating between positive and negative engagement. Any engagement is going to push something farther. So as a general rule, you don't want to like, comment, share any post that you don't want to spread farther, even if you are trying to debunk it. And this can be so, so hard to do. But if you see somebody sharing something that is false, you have to decide basically, Is there any chance that I can have like a real conversation with them? Is this somebody I know and can talk to? And if so, you want to have that conversation with them in a private space. You want to direct message them or email them or text them. And if it's not somebody you have any sort of sway over, you're just going to leave it alone because you don't want to engage with it further. That's just going to spread it. The next thing you can do if you do decide that you need to respond in some way is I really like a truth sandwich format when it does come time to respond to something. This is a way of responding very indirectly where you are not going to repeat false claims. You are not going to sort of, spread something inadvertently, but you are still going to counter something and push back against it. So this way of doing messaging comes from George Lakoff. He is a linguist, and he talks about how our brains remember what we hear first and what we hear most often. So you can bring that concept into your messaging. So you want the like buns of your sandwich to be positive, proactive messaging, because that's the most memorable part of your message, is the thing you say first and the thing you sort of repeat and say at the end. You want to do your sort of disinformation disrupting in the middle because that's the least memorable part of your message, and that's not what you want people to walk away thinking about. So I have some examples here from a group at Indivisible that I work with called the Truth Brigade. They have developed their own sort of take on this truth sandwich, and so they engage volunteers to like create and spread these new truth sandwich messages. So when we do truth sandwiches, we always start with a positive and we always start with common ground. And the idea here is that this is going to prime people to trust the rest of your message because you are telling them, here's the thing everybody can agree with. We care about the same things. We share the same values. It's a way of positioning yourself as a trusted messenger. Then you can move on to disrupting that harmful claim. And typically the way I say to do this is to focus on a logic correction over a fact correction. So again, your goal is to trigger somebody's critical thinking. Your goal is not necessarily to fact check it very directly. So a lot of times when we do this work, we will ask questions about like, why would somebody lie to you? What do you think they're trying to achieve? Who do you think is behind this? And that's a way of sort of like leading the horse to water, so to speak, because when people come to their own conclusions that they don't trust something, that's going to be more powerful than if you just tell them not to trust something. So we do that sort of critical thinking, questioning in the middle. And then we always want to end on a positive message, a proactive message, whatever you want people to take away on the topic. So I've got a couple examples here from the Truth Brigade of what this can look like when it comes to voting. So I'll just read one of these examples here that is sort of countering this idea that we need election results on election day and any vote counted after election day is untrustworthy. That is not true, so we're trying to push back on that. So this message starts with a positive message saying, we all hope for quick election results, but our democracy is worth the wait. Then it pivots to that critical thinking piece. Officials might need more time this year to ensure every vote is counted fairly. Isn't that a good thing? And then we end on our positive message, which is about planning to vote, be patient. Democracy is strongest when every voice is heard. All right, and then last couple slides here before we take questions. Regardless of these very specific tactics, I want to be clear that big picture, the goal is actually not necessarily to like force more truth out into the world, but it's to build more trust. And that is because we as humans, it's too hard to tell what's real and what's not online. And so we tend to determine truth based on who we trust. So that trust piece is really important. So that means that when you are thinking about how you are sort of engaging online, how you are approaching somebody, how you're having these conversations, if you work for some organization that's using social media, like what those strategies look like, it is more important to think about how you can use social media to build and reinforce trust. And that's just as important as thinking about how to fact check or get ahead of something with a message. So when we think about building trust on social media, we're thinking about things like, how do we make people feel like they're being heard? How do we come across as relatable and authentic so people trust us? How do we make sure they hear from us often enough that we're sort of known and familiar, because that breeds trust? So this kind of like repetition, authenticity, having an emotional connection to the way somebody is feeling, that stuff is going to take you really far in trust building. And then finally, my last tip for having these kinds of hard discussions, when we do get into a place, particularly in a private setting, where we are having to confront somebody about something we know is not true, this can be really hard to do. So my tips are: one, always be civil. Again, your goal is to, protect the trust piece of this relationship. Your goal is to build trust and to come away as a trusted messenger, and that's the most important piece. Always try to find common ground, and this can be so hard if somebody is like way off into a radical ideology, but as much as you can keep bringing them back to the things you have in common, that's going to help with that trust piece. I talked a little bit about the fact corrections and the logic corrections. You've got to do a little bit of both. You've got to correct the facts and give them the truth, but also you've got to talk about, why is somebody lying to you, who is lying to you, how are they lying to you, and get them to do some critical thinking. A thing I talk about a lot is like, respond to what they mean more than what they say. Somebody can come at you with some like really wild conspiracy. Somebody can come at you and say, I read that, Bill Gates created the bird flu in one of his labs or something. And you can try to correct that factually, because there's no basis in that. You can like try to pull up data to disprove that, but you're missing the point to them, which is, the world feels scary. There are people out there who are controlling things and they are hurting me, and I don't know who is in charge anymore. And so it's more important to respond to the feeling behind some of these conspiracies than the conspiracies themselves. And then my final point is, pick your battles and then be patient. Not everybody is going to change their mind, and almost nobody is going to change their mind based on one conversation. A lot of times we will get into these kind of like hard back and forths, and then people go their separate ways, and they're going to sit with that feeling, and they're going to think about that for the rest of the night or the next couple days. They might go home and do a little bit more research. They might think about what you've said. And that's where the change is going to happen, is in the follow-up after the conversation. So don't be, hurt or disappointed if one conversation doesn't fix things. Engage where you feel like you can engage, and then let somebody sort of stew in what you have said, and just try to make sure you are having those conversations in a way that's productive. And at the end of the day, you're not going to change every mind, and none of us should put that pressure on ourselves or that responsibility. Okay, I've talked for a really long time. We have a few minutes left. I've got a few minutes left for questions, and would love to hear from you all.
The slide that you had that had the news titles on it, there was some confusion about, were those ideas false, or was it that's who was saying it was twisting it to being false? Because I know the Arlington Cemetery was on there.
Yeah, those were just headlines that were sort of examples of disinformation in early 2025. So there was a story about Arlington Cemetery that is removing content about Black and female veterans from the website. This is part of like an anti-DEI push.
Mhm.
So that would be a case where, the idea that like Black and female veterans didn't really earn their medals or awards, and so we're not going to talk about their achievements. That is an example of disinformation in 2025. There was some stuff on there about non-citizen voting, about Doge claiming that they have saved tens of billions of dollars, and that is not true.
The
Trump
mice
and
thing, the
Yeah, the
transgender versus
transgender and
transgenic.
transgenic mice. Yes. So that was just me offering examples of like specific disinformation narratives from the past couple of weeks.
Someone asked, why do the far right sources captures minds so strongly?
Yeah, I think there are a few pieces, and that kind of gets to those tactics, those 5 tactics that I went through, their ability to manipulate algorithms, their ability to just do this in a way that's like good comms, right? The sort of like things that are just memorable. They are picking topics and framing things in a way that provokes strong emotions. Some of it is like artificial fake stuff, not all of it, but that's definitely in the mix. And then the fact that they are engaging on these sort of like culture and lifestyle issues, and not always just political issues. Those are a few of the things that make those networks really powerful.
Is radio mostly far right in rural areas?
Great question. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that there is a strong prevalence of conservative talk radio, particularly in rural areas, that is very powerful. And there is no equivalent on the left of like progressive talk radio in those places. So that is definitely part of that media imbalance for sure.
Midas, there was a lot of discussion about Midas in the chat. Are they getting more views than Joe Rogan these days? That's what folks have heard.
Oh, this is Midas Touch. I think I did see something about that they recently hit more followers or more downloads or something than Joe Rogan. So that is, yes, that is I will try to find the source for that, but that was a real thing that I have also seen a little bit about. But I think the bigger point is like, this gets back to that Media Matters study with the bubbles, is like, it's great that progressives have a Midas touch that can compete with a Joe Rogan, but when you look at the whole landscape and ecosystem, we are still like way outnumbered
Mhm.
compared to the right. And so like we need a bunch more Midas touches on a whole bunch of different, topic areas and appealing to different people.
So another question was about executive orders. If they go against laws that are already passed, he just can't do away with laws with an executive order, can he?
You know, yeah, this is a question for a lawyer. Here's what I will say about the disinformation piece of this. Like, what we are seeing today is a lot of policy making that is based on disinformation. So, like, passing an executive order is not itself disinformation, that is policy making. But what we are seeing is this big set of these online accounts that are justifying these executive orders with false and harmful misleading information. So claiming that we need to deport immigrants because of all of these quote unquote harms coming from immigrant communities that are totally
Mhm.
false.
Mhm.
Claiming that we need to not let trans kids play sports because of XYZ false lie about trans kids. Like,
Mhm.
this stuff is being supported and justified and propped up with disinformation. But when it comes to the actual executive orders, like, they're policies, right? But they're rooted in false and harmful claims.
Um, so somebody asked, how do we deprogram the cult? And somebody else answered, I'm not sure that we can.
This is the pick your battles part, right? Is like, it's going to be really hard. But again, this gets back to the overall imbalance. Like, the culture is being skewed toward the right and toward, some of these harmful narratives. And this is just like the ecosystem that we are in. And until we have, I don't know, some billionaire or a few billionaires who can like help us, create enough sort of media properties or influencers or news. Like, we need better journal, like all of this stuff, but we need to correct for that media imbalance, which is a really big task, and it's not a quick fix.
I
And we
think
also need better regulations for tech company. Part of this is about the incentives that social media companies have on their platforms. And it's
Mhm.
very easy for them to just walk away from some of these safety measures that they used to have in place. And that makes a difference too.
Somebody just asked if religion was pushing some of this, the misinformation, and um, how much is religion impacting misinformation and disinformation?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. I'm going to tread lightly there and just say I don't think it is fair to blame like all religion for mis and disinformation, but certainly there are churches and religious leaders who are maybe more interested in political power and political gain and are fueling some of this disinformation through, you know, this like trusted lens of a church and a religious congregation, and that is really powerful and really harmful.
One of the things, and I know you said it about not repeating the misinformation and disinformation, which also goes along with other uh, episodes and things that we have had. One of the things that I see though is that that's what that side does. They just repeat, 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 and that's why folks fall for it because they keep hearing it over and over and over and again. So that's why, it's good for us not to be repeating it. Just wanted to kind of bring that out there.
Yeah,
We have
exactly.
got a couple minutes left. Somebody did ask about social media influencers, and I think you touched on how they make their money, but they were asking specifically is, are they directly paid by the right wing, or, or created by the right wing? Where did this, kind of really come from?
Yeah, it's really a mix of both, and it's a really interesting sort of set of business models. Some of this is you have organizations. Turning Point USA is one that I will pick on that has been really good at identifying like young college students who are good on social media and sort of incubating them and helping them grow their audience. And I don't know the specifics, but like almost assuredly there is some financial business relationship there, where they can kind of incubate these influencers and grow them into these big personas online. Um, a lot of influencers are just kind of good at grifting, right? A lot of this is they're all selling, particularly in the wellness industry, they're all selling a vitamin supplement or a whatever. And so some of them are just making their money off of sort of the grift. Some of this is coming from, sort of right-wing donors, but it's like a mix of all of it.
Well, Kelsey, it's 8:30. I want to thank you so very much for coming and sharing tonight. That was really super informative. I know that folks really enjoyed the slides, especially the one that had the acronym, kind of to help folks remember things. Do you have anything you want to share before we adjourn?
No, just thank you all so much for being here and for caring about this. I know it can be really hard to not sort of give up on social media or communicating in general. And so the fact that, I'm meeting so many of you who really want to do this well and try to push back on these harms, just, gives me a lot of hope. So thank you all.
And with that, I'm going to say good night.